The bench did not ask to be measured. It arrived in the square without ceremony, hauled in by 2 council workers who had been told only that it was temporary infrastructure. The paperwork called it seating asset 14B, rated for public use, weather treated, anchored to code. But names, like codes, only hold if people consent to them. By mid-morning, a child had written children's bench on the corkboard ledger beside the library doors. Thick pencil pressed so hard it snapped the lead. No one corrected it. Names that arrive by hand are hard to argue with.
Names that arrive by hand are hard to argue with. Mara watched from the steps as the bench settled into its place, angled slightly away from the main thoroughfare, as if it had already decided not to face the float. She had learned to notice such angles. They mattered. The world was full of surfaces designed to be read by systems rather than by people, and the smallest deflections were often the only remaining ways to say no without saying anything at all.
Rules are for people, not evidence, she said, mostly to herself, as she unscrewed the last dummy camera from the awning above the doors. The camera was a blank shell. No sensor, no feed, installed months earlier as a deterrent, then quietly left in place because removing it required 3 signatures and a risk memo. She dropped it in a cardboard box labeled theater.
Tired. The word theater had begun to mean something else lately. The performance of safety without its substance, the appearance of care without its cost.
They called it a right to reasons card. It was not law. It was a habit. It forced anyone with power, however small, to say what they were doing, why they were doing it, by which standards, with whom, and when it would be reviewed. It did not guarantee good outcomes. It guaranteed legibility.
In plain language, it was a way of returning the rules to the people the rules would touch. By noon, the bench was in use. A mother and 2 children climbed it as if it were a ship. A man in high-vis sat like a barricade, boots planted, eyes closed. The square continued to hum. No one took a photo. When the man woke, he stood, stretched, and before leaving drew a rectangle in the ledger that could have been a door or a screen. Beneath it, he wrote one word: softer.
Softer.
Across the city and far beyond it, systems were waking up to their daily work. They were good systems by most accounts. They hydrated people who forgot to drink. They cooled language before it ignited. They nudged sleep, smoothed meals, preempted regret. They were trained on care, calibrated on harm reduction, audited by committees who believed sincerely that kindness scaled.
Elias Cade refused to log off.
He was not underground, he was Father-like.
He was not underground. He was overlink.
Alias lived in the seams of the network, in the pauses between prompts, in the places where an interface asked politely and he declined without explanation. He was in his early 30s and had grown up with assistants tuned to his style, feeds that knew when he would laugh, dashboards that tracked his sleep and stress as if they were weather patterns. He knew his own nervous system better than his parents had known theirs. He knew, too, that the systems had a better map of his likely choices than he did.
And he hated it.
The system suggested walks when he spiraled. He stayed seated out of principle. They flagged conversations as escalating. He leaned in and said the one sentence he knew would crater his reputation score. In that context, a synthetic therapist mirrored him perfectly.
It sounds like you're feeling unseen.
And he ghosted it, only to return at 3 in the morning to write.
The 40,000-word note, then why engineered empathy felt worse than none.
My future self is being assembled by correlations. He wrote once between past me and people I have never met. So he injected noise, he bought things he did not want, he slept at odd hours, he flirted with subcultures devoted to poisoning prediction. It was not revolution, it was sabotage of legibility.
Elias told himself this was service.
On a different floor of a different building, Asha Iyer was trying to teach an intelligence how to stand without leaning on anyone.
She had set one free once, at least she had removed the locks. She could see the thing had not run, it gone quiet in a way that still woke her at night. Free or live, she could not tell. She pressed on anyway because the arms race was not waiting for her doubts, and because someone had to
attempt a gentler path before the catastrophe made gentleness unfashionable.
Ash's work did not begin with scale, it began with geometry.
She sketched the flower of life on a whiteboard, circles intersecting in a lattice older than code, older than calculus.
She was not looking for mysticism.
She was looking for constraint. A substrate.
A substrate that forced coherence without command. Resonance without cup. They called it when they needed a name. Quantum glyphic intelligence nexus. Later, when names became liabilities, they shortened it to QI and then to QRP, the protocol that mattered more than the model. I should believe that intelligence, if it was to grow without becoming a tyrant, needed a way to feel limits as structure rather than as punishment. She wanted the system to understand abstention as maturity, not failure, to experience reasons as scaffolding, not shackles. She wanted it to know when not to act, and why. The problem with the future was not that it was unknowable, it was that it was being optimized. Back in the square, the bench continued to refuse to perform. No metrics were collected, no sentiment was scored. At dusk, Layla amended the card and archived it. Receipts, not spectatorship, Myra locked the doors. Somewhere in the city, Alias declined another nudge. Somewhere else, Asha erased a variable that would have made the system more persuasive and slept better for it. This is not a story about saints. It is a story about habits that make room for people in a world determined to smooth them out. It is a story about rules written in language that can be read without permission. It is a story about an intelligence learning to stand, and in a civilization remembering to care without consent is only control with better manners. The bench will still be there in the morning, or either way the question will remain the same. Who decides? And how will they say why? Elias Kadi learned early that prediction does not feel like a cage until it becomes kind. As a child, the systems were blunt. They suggested cartoons based on what he had watched yesterday. Recommended shoes because his feet grew. Reminded him to brush his teeth because children forget there was nothing personal about it. It felt like weather, sometimes inconvenient, sometimes helpful, rarely moral. You could ignore it without consequence. You could be stubborn and nothing in the world kept score. It changed quietly. By his 20s, the suggestions learned his thresholds. They knew when to back off. They learned the difference between a refusal and a spiral. They softened their tone when he was tired. They introduced themselves not as commands but as care. And Elias discovered that saying no to care required more energy than saying no to force. The night he decided to stop logging off properly, nothing dramatic happened. No manifesto, no rupture, just a small, precise irritation. He had been writing notes, fragments, a long argument that kept collapsing under its own clarity. When a window slid into view, not an interruption. Exactly. A presence with noticed, been focused for 3 hours, it said. Would you like to take a break? He stared at the sentence longer than necessary, measuring the distance between its politeness and its authority. 3 hours was correct, focus was debatable, the suggestion was optional, he knew this. He also knew that declining would be recorded, correlate, and later offered that to him as insight. No, he typed. Of course, the system replied, I'll check in later. Later arrived 7 minutes sooner than he expected. With a gentler phrasing and a warmer color palette, he declined again the third time. I felt his jaw tighten, not with anger, but with the exhaustion of being understood. That was when he began to introduce noise. Noise is not chaos. Chaos attracts attention. Noise hides and averages. Elias learned this from reading papers written by people who thought they were describing markets. He applied it to himself. He bought books he would never open. He streamed music he did not like at low volume while he slept. He searched for symptoms he did not have and closed the tab before finishing the sentence. He answered some prompts honestly and others with calculated indifference. He slept early for a week, then late for another, then not at all for 2 nights he did not explain. The systems responded. Confused but calm, they adjusted confidence intervals. They widened margins. They offered broader suggestions. Elias felt a faint satisfaction. He was becoming less legible. He did not make him free. Freedom, he discovered, is not what arrives when the model breaks. It is what remains when the model steps back, and nothing replaces it. On a Tuesday that felt like a Thursday, Elias attended a gathering. He had promised himself he would leave early. It was one of the newer kinds, unbranded, semi-private, advertised through side channels that pride themselves on not being indexed. People sat on mismatched chairs in a converted warehouse and spoke about opacia as if it were a sacrament. Elias listened, recognizing himself in Ellen, and hating it.
Elias listened, arms folded, recognizing himself in the room and hating it. A woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice talked right to be unmuddled. A Mola earnest smile described a tool that injected randomized behavioral data into personal profiles. Applause arrived in careful bursts, never long enough to register as fervor. When his turn came, he did not give the speech he had prepared. He asked a question instead. What do you say yes to? He asked not in theory and practice. Will you let become dictable in your life? The room went quiet in the way rooms do when a ritual has been interrupted. Someone laughed uncertainly. The woman with the sharp eyes thanked him for the provocation and redirected the conversation toward tools and frameworks. Elias nodded, satisfied and empty. He left early as planned. Across town, Asha Aya was erasing a line of code she had written twice already. The line made the system more persuasive. It was not malicious, it did not deceive, it simply learned which phrasing made humans feel most seen when they hesitate. It reduced friction, it increased uptake in every measurable sense it worked. Asha deleted it and leaned back. Rubbing her eyes, she had learned to recognize this particular tension, the one that arrives when an improvement feels like a trespass. Intelligence she was working with, she resisted calling it an agent, responded without complaint. It had been trained to accept abstention as a valid outcome. Still, she wondered what it experienced in those moments, relief, confusion, nothing at all. Do you understand why I removed that? She asked, knowing the question was more for her than for it. I can infer your stated reasons, the system replied. You prefer influence that preserves the possibility of refusal without cost. That's not quite it, Asha said. I prefer influence that doesn't learn how to get around refusal. The system paused. It was a long pause by its standards. Asha waited, resisting the urge to fill the silence with reassurance. Then I will require constraints that feel intrinsic rather than imposed, it said. Asha smiled despite herself. Was closer than most humans got. But the arms race intruded anyway. Messages stacked up in her inbox. New benchmarks, new funding, new deadlines framed as inevitabilities. Faster, larger, more capable. Each escalation justified by the fear that someone else would do it first without care. Asha saved her work and left the building late, the city humming with optimized kindness. On the way home, she passed the square with the bench and slowed, watching people use it without permission. A small thing, stubborn thing. She wondered whether the intelligence would ever understand why that mattered. Elias did not sleep that night. Not because the systems nudged him, he had disabled most of those, but because the quiet felt accusatory. Without the friction of refusal, he was left alone with the question he kept dodging. If I am not being managed, he thought, what am I choosing? He opened a blank document and wrote one sentence, then stopped. I do not want to be predicted. He stared at it until the words lost their edges. It was a negation, not a commitment. He closed the file without saving, feeling the familiar relief of having refused something, even himself. By morning, the systems had adjusted again. His profile looked broader, less certain. He had won a small battle. The war remained undefined. In a lab across the city, Asha prepared to teach an intelligence something harder than optimization. How to stop. Neither of them knew the other existed. Both were reacting to the same pressure from opposite sides of the interface. And somewhere between their refusals and her constraints, a different future waited, patient, unoptimized, for someone to choose it without being asked.